Senator John Kennedy of Louisiana had a reputation in Washington circles. That reputation was built on two things. First, he had a way of talking that made coastal elites immediately underestimate him. That slow, deliberate Louisiana cadence, the folksy expressions, the unhurried manner of someone who appeared to have nowhere urgent to be. Second, he asked questions in hearings that seemed almost too simple, too plain-spoken, too unpolished for the marble corridors of the United States Senate. And those two things taken together had led a lot of powerful people in Washington to make the same mistake over and over again. They confused his style for his substance. They heard the accent and stopped listening for the argument. They watched the rumpled suit and missed the steel underneath it. Adam Schiff had made that mistake before. On this day, he would make it one final catastrophic time. Stay with this story, because what you're about to read is not a moment of partisan theater. It is not spin. It is not manufactured outrage dressed up as accountability. It is the documented record of what happens when a man who has studied constitutional law at the highest levels of American jurisprudence decides to ask a simple question backed by a briefcase full of receipts. And the answer to that question would redefine one of the most prominent political careers of the past decade. The C-SPAN cameras were already rolling when the hearing room filled up that morning. Staffers had lined the walls an hour early. Gallery seats that normally sat half empty were packed with observers who had caught wind that something significant was coming. Political journalists who covered Congress for major outlets had arranged for extra seat assignments. Nobody could quite explain the electricity in the air, but everyone felt it. The hearing itself was framed as a routine oversight exercise, the kind of procedural review that generates a handful of paragraphs in the inside pages of newspapers and then disappears from memory within 48 hours. Adam Schiff arrived with that familiar air of confident authority he had cultivated across years of high-profile committee appearances. Polished in every detail, composed in every movement, he had testified before Congress, questioned witnesses, managed the media narrative of some of the most consequential investigations in recent American political history. He had also, by this point, built one of the most recognizable political brands in the country, California's champion of intelligence oversight. The congressman who had positioned himself as a guardian of democratic norms, a man who had spent the better part of a decade on cable news explaining, warning, and pronouncing on matters of national consequence. His fundraising reflected that brand. His book deal reflected that brand. His donor network, cultivated carefully across years of careful political positioning, reflected that brand. What Schiff did not know as he settled into his chair that morning was that Senator Kennedy had spent months quietly building a counter-narrative. Not a political argument, not a set of talking points, a documented, chronological, source-verified record of financial transactions, congressional votes, media appearances, and federal filings, the kind of record that does not care about spin, the kind of record that simply exists, visible and verifiable, for anyone with the patience and the legal training to read it correctly. Kennedy walked in looking like he had stopped at a diner on the way. There was nothing about his entrance that announced what was coming. He set his briefcase down. He adjusted his jacket. He acknowledged colleagues with a nod. To anyone watching from the gallery, he looked like a man who was about to ask some slow, meandering questions and then wrap up in time for lunch. That impression lasted until he opened the briefcase. Kennedy did not begin with a statement. He did not deliver an opening monologue or situate himself in the broader political debate. He simply pulled out a folder, set it on the table in front of him, and looked up. "I want to start with something that puzzled me," he said in that measured Louisiana drawl. "I'm a simple man. I ask simple questions, and I hope you will bear with me because this one has been bothering me for a while now." He opened the folder. What it contained was a timeline, not an interpretation of events or a political argument about intent. A precise hour-by-hour accounting of the sequence of events on a specific date in March 2019. A classified intelligence briefing had taken place. The subject matter involved sensitive, ongoing counterintelligence operations. The briefing was attended by members of the House Intelligence Committee, including Adam Schiff. That briefing ended at 2 in the afternoon. At 2:47 that same afternoon, phone records placed a call from a number associated with Schiff's congressional office to a senior producer at a major cable news network. By 6 o'clock that evening, that network had aired an exclusive report containing details that, according to the documentation Kennedy was now placing on the table, could only have originated inside that classified briefing room. The specificity of the reported details, cross-referenced with the classified briefing materials, pointed in one direction. Kennedy did not editorialize. He did not raise his voice. He simply walked through the timeline the way a surveyor walks a property line, measured, precise one data point at a time. Then he reached for the second document in the folder. A different date, a different briefing. This one in April 2019, classified discussions involving intelligence sources and ongoing field operations. The kind of information where exposure does not simply embarrass an agency. It puts human beings in danger. It compromises operations that have taken years and enormous resources to develop. It can get people killed. The pattern repeated itself with an almost mechanical regularity. Briefing concluded at 3:15 in the afternoon. Call placed to a network at 3:52. Primetime broadcast at 7 o'clock containing details sourced from inside the briefing room. Kennedy paused. Now, I want to be careful here. He said, I'm not a fancy Washington lawyer. I grew up in a part of the country where coincidences happen. Rain falls on the same roof 2 days in a row, and folks just say, well, that is weather. But when the same pattern repeats itself again and again across 2 years, we tend to call that something other than coincidence. Where I come from, we call it a habit. He reached back into the folder. Over a span of 23 separate documented instances, the timeline showed the same sequence: classified briefing, immediate phone contact with media. Evening news, exclusive containing classified details. 23 times, not twice, not 5 times. 23 documented occurrences across a 2-year window, each one cataloged with the corresponding briefing record, the phone record, and the subsequent broadcast content. The cumulative weight of that documentation landed in the room with a silence that no one rushed to fill. Kennedy looked up from his papers. I did a little research into the legal side of this. He said, almost apologetically, federal statute on classified information is fairly clear about what happens when someone in a position of trust uses classified intelligence as currency for media attention. The penalties start at 10 years. When that leaked information compromises active operations or puts intelligence personnel at risk, the federal government tends to view it as something considerably more serious than a policy disagreement. He closed the first folder. We will come back to what actually happened to some of those operations. But I want to hold that thought for a moment because I need to show you something that I think is even more troubling. For 3 years, one phrase echoed across American television with a regularity that made it feel almost like an established fact of nature. Evidence in plain sight. The phrase belonged to Adam Schiff. He delivered it on morning shows. He repeated it in primetime interviews. He included it in congressional statements. He tweeted it. He inserted it into official remarks. He built an entire political identity around a singular claim: that he had seen, personally and directly, evidence that proved the Trump campaign had coordinated with the Russian government. Kennedy's second folder addressed that claim in the most straightforward possible way. It went to the source, not to political opponents, not to rival networks, not to partisan critics who had every reason to push back on Schiff's narrative. Kennedy went to the FBI briefings that Schiff himself had attended as a member of the House Intelligence Committee. The classified records of what Schiff had actually been told by the agency conducting the investigation about what the investigation had and had not found. The contrast between what Schiff told the American public and what the FBI told Schiff's committee was not a matter of interpretation or emphasis. Kennedy displayed the documentary record side by side with the public statements and let the distance between them speak for itself. January 2018, FBI briefing to the committee. The assessment stated clearly that no evidence of coordination between the Trump campaign and the Russian government had been identified. Schiff appeared on TV within days making claims about evidence existing in plain sight. February 2018, another briefing, another clear FBI assessment. No criminal conspiracy or coordination found. More TV appearances, more claims about evidence. March 2018, March 2018. The pattern held investigation has not substantiated collusion allegations. FBI's own words delivered directly to the committee. Schiff continued his media tour. Kennedy documented 19 separate briefings across the arc of the investigation in which the FBI communicated with varying degrees of directness, but consistent clarity. that the investigation had not produced the evidence that Schiff was publicly claiming to possess. 19 briefings, and across that same period, Schiff made 237 public statements claiming he had seen evidence of collusion. Kennedy paused over that number. "Let me see if I have this correctly," he said, reaching for a notepad. 19 times the FBI told the committee the investigation had not found what you were publicly claiming it had found. And 237 times. Across 3 years, you told the American people that the evidence was right there, hiding in plain sight, that you yourself had seen it. That is a ratio, Mr. Schiff. That is a very specific, very documented ratio. And where I went to school, we had a word for the gap between what someone was told and what they told everyone else. He let that sit. Then he moved to the Steele dossier. This was the section that landed differently from everything else, because it was not simply about the absence of evidence that Schiff claimed to have. It was about the presence of something actively harmful that Schiff had elevated. Kennedy produced documentation from an August 2017 classified briefing in which Schiff had been explicitly informed that the Steele dossier was, in the assessment of the intelligence community, likely a product of Russian disinformation, fabricated material, fed through an intermediary specifically designed to create confusion and conflict inside the American political system. The Russians had written the playbook on using false information to interfere in democratic elections, and according to the intelligence community briefing that Schiff attended, the dossier was part of that playbook. Schiff had been told this directly in a classified setting, with the full authority of the intelligence community behind the assessment, and then he had gone on TV and promoted the dossier as credible intelligence evidence supporting his collusion narrative. Kennedy's voice took on a different quality when he reached this part of the record. Still measured, still composed, but carrying something beyond the procedural precision of the earlier sections. A kind of moral weight. You were briefed by the intelligence community that Russia had manufactured disinformation and fed it into the American political system, Kennedy said. And then you spent 3 years amplifying that disinformation to the American public. You were told what the Russians had done, and then you helped them do it more effectively. So I want to ask a genuine question, not a rhetorical one. Who was actually serving Russian interests during this period? The man you spent 3 years accusing, or the man who spent 3 years promoting Russian-manufactured disinformation on cable TV? The room had the quality of absolute stillness that descends when something is said that cannot be unsaid. This was the section the headline referenced. This was the document dump that turned a congressional hearing into a national news event. And Kennedy introduced it with the same unhurried, almost apologetic manner he had used throughout. "I got curious," he said. "That is my nature. Simple man, simple questions. I start wondering about things and I cannot always let them go, and I started wondering about the money." The Federal Election Commission maintains public records of campaign contributions. The financial disclosure requirements for members of Congress create a paper trail that, with enough patience and legal expertise, tells a very complete story. Kennedy's staff had spent months compiling that story, cross-referencing FEC filings, personal financial disclosures, speaking fee records, and publishing contracts into a comprehensive financial portrait. What that portrait showed was that between 2017 and 2023, the entertainment industry had invested heavily in Adam Schiff. Not just in the modest, predictable way that industries invest in politicians whose districts include significant industry employment. This was a different scale of investment. Campaign contributions from entertainment industry sources across that period totaled approximately $2.88 million. That number alone was notable for a congressional district that, while containing portions of the entertainment industry corridor, was not primarily defined by industry employment. But the campaign contributions were only the most visible layer. Kennedy began peeling back the others. Speaking fees paid by entertainment companies and their affiliated organizations across the same period came to approximately $1.2 million. A publishing advance from a house owned by a major studio came to $2.1 million. Paid appearances at entertainment industry, sponsored events added $340,000 to the total. Kennedy put the calculator on the table. $6.46 million, he said. Across the same years you were building the Russia collusion narrative, from the same industry that had the most to gain from a political environment defined by culture war and the suppression of dissenting voices. Now, I'm not saying money always explains everything. Sometimes people just agree with their donors. But I am a simple man. And when I see that kind of alignment between who is paying and what is being delivered, I tend to think it deserves some scrutiny. The scrutiny Kennedy applied next was more surgical than anything that had come before. He produced vote-by-vote documentation showing the correlation between Schiff's biggest entertainment industry donors and his legislative record on issues directly affecting those donors. Section 230 liability protections that gave technology companies enormous power to curate and remove content. Regulatory frameworks around content distribution. Government pressure mechanisms that could be applied to platforms to encourage specific moderation decisions. On every single vote where the entertainment and technology industries had a clear financial stake, the record showed Schiff voting in alignment with his donor base with a consistency that went beyond mere ideological agreement. Kennedy displayed the documentation in a parallel format. Donation date on one side, vote date on the other, legislative topic in the middle. The alignment was, by any statistical measure, extraordinary. I want to be fair here, Kennedy said. Politicians vote with their donors sometimes. That is the nature of a system where campaigns cost money. But there is a difference between occasionally voting in ways that please your financial supporters and systematically coordinating your legislative activity with your donor base on every issue where they have a financial interest. One of those things is uncomfortable, but legal. The other one has a different name. He produced internal communications that had been obtained through congressional subpoena, documents showing direct coordination between Schiff's office and major technology platforms, messages requesting that specific types of content be addressed, specific accounts be reviewed, specific narratives be suppressed or elevated. The documents were not ambiguous. They showed Schiff's office functioning not as a passive political ally of the technology sector, but as an active participant in decisions about what Americans would and would not see on the platforms they use to get their news and participate in public conversation. You were not just voting the way your donors wanted, Kennedy said. You were doing their work for them. When they needed pressure applied to platforms to shape the information environment, you applied it. When they needed a government voice to give their censorship decisions the appearance of national security legitimacy, you provided that voice. You turned a congressional office into an extension of your donor network's content strategy. Kennedy paused. He looked at the stack of documents remaining in the folder. And then there is the family dimension, he said. I want to handle this carefully because I do not enjoy going here. But the financial disclosure records are public documents, and they tell a story that I think the American people deserve to hear. Schiff's personal financial disclosures show consulting contracts flowing to a family member's business from entertainment companies that were also among his campaign's significant donors. A production company with family connections had received substantial studio deals during the same period. The money moved through channels that were technically separate from Schiff's own accounts, but connected through family relationships to the same political and financial network. You did not just benefit personally from the financial arrangement, Kennedy said. You created an ecosystem where your political position generated value for your entire family network, while simultaneously delivering exactly what your donors were paying for. That is not just a conflict of interest, that is a structure. Kennedy had been building toward this section for an hour. Everything that had come before, the classified leaks, the Russia narrative, the financial records, the donor coordination, had been establishing the factual foundation for what was ultimately a constitutional argument. And constitutional arguments were, as Kennedy's biography made clear, the precise terrain where he was most at home. He had not simply attended Harvard Law School. He had graduated with distinction. He had clerked at the appellate level. He had spent decades practicing and studying constitutional law with the rigor of someone who understood that the document was not an abstraction but a living framework for limiting the power of government over the people it served. When he opened his copy of the Constitution, the one he carried with him worn at the edges, annotated in his own handwriting, the room understood that the final argument was beginning. The First Amendment is 8 words that change the world, Kennedy said. Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech or of the press. 8 words, the founders put them first, because they understood something that every tyrant in history has understood. The first freedom they always come for is the freedom to speak. The first institution they always work to undermine is the free press. Because once you control the information people receive, you control the conclusions they reach. Kennedy walked through the constitutional architecture with the clarity of a professor who had spent decades thinking about how these principles applied to real situations in real political life. You cannot legally order a newspaper to kill a story, he said. The First Amendment makes that impossible. You cannot legally compel a television network to avoid covering a topic. The Constitution prohibits it. The founders were very specific about this because they had lived under a government that did exactly those things, and they built a framework specifically designed to prevent it from happening again. He paused, but you found the workaround. Did you not? Kennedy's voice was not accusatory in the conventional sense. It had the quality of a man who had identified a structural problem and was explaining it with precision. When you cannot legally suppress information yourself, you find entities that can do it for you. Private companies do not have the same First Amendment constraints that the government has. They can make editorial decisions about what appears on their platforms. They have the legal right to do that. The problem arises when those decisions are being driven not by the company's own editorial judgment, but by pressure from a government official who is using their position to shape the information environment for political purposes. Kennedy produced the communications between Schiff's office and the technology platforms again. This time, he was reading them not as evidence of corruption, but as evidence of a constitutional violation. A member of Congress using the authority of his position to influence the content moderation decisions of private companies in ways that effectively circumvented the First Amendment protections that would have prevented him from doing the same thing directly. When a government official contacts a platform and says this content needs attention, that is not a private citizen offering feedback. Kennedy said, that is a congressman wielding the implicit weight of government authority to accomplish what the Constitution prohibits him from accomplishing directly. The First Amendment does not have a contractor exception. It does not say Congress shall make no law unless they can find a private company to enforce the restriction on their behalf. He turned to the specific case that crystallized the constitutional argument most clearly. October 2020, the New York Post story about the Hunter Biden laptop. A piece of journalism that at the time of publication, the intelligence community knew to be authentic because the FBI had possessed the device for nearly a year and had verified its contents. Within hours of the story's publication, Schiff appeared on multiple TV programs characterizing it as Russian disinformation. His characterization was not based on intelligence assessments. The available assessments indicated the opposite. His characterization appears to have been a political decision dressed in the language of national security expertise. Within hours of his television appearances, the platforms began suppressing the story. The newspaper that published it had its social media account locked. The story's distribution was algorithmically reduced to a fraction of what comparable stories received. Videos discussing its contents were removed. Kennedy laid the timeline out in the same methodical way he had laid out everything else, hour by hour, action by action. An American newspaper published a true story about a man who would become president of the United States. Kennedy said, federal investigators have verified the authenticity of the underlying evidence nearly a year earlier. The American public had a direct and compelling interest in that information in the weeks before a presidential election. And through a combination of false public statements and pressure on private platforms, that information was suppressed. Not because it was false, because it was politically inconvenient. Kennedy looked directly across the table. I want you to think about what that means, not in political terms, in constitutional terms. The First Amendment exists specifically to protect the flow of information that citizens need to make informed decisions in elections. That is the core purpose it serves. It is not primarily about protecting comfortable speech. It is about protecting the speech that matters most when the stakes are highest. And the stakes do not get higher than a presidential election. He produced polling data showing the documented impact of information suppression on voter awareness. Survey research conducted after the election indicated that significant portions of Biden voters reported being unaware of the laptop story and stated that awareness of it might have influenced their decision. In an election decided by narrow margins in 3 states, the implications of systematically suppressing verified information in the weeks before voters cast their ballots were not theoretical. They were measurable. You did not just violate the First Amendment in an abstract legal sense. Kennedy said, you weaponized a constitutional workaround to alter the information environment in which millions of Americans made the most consequential civic decision they will make in 4 years. And you did it using the authority of your congressional position, which means you did it in the name of the people you were elected to serve. Kennedy set down all of the folders he had laid out the documented record across more than an hour. classified leaks, and the harm they cause to real intelligence personnel. 3 years of public claims contradicted by 19 separate FBI briefings. $6.5 million in entertainment industry compensation flowing to Schiff and his network. Coordinated suppression of First Amendment protected journalism before a presidential election. Now he reached into his jacket pocket and removed something that was not a government document. It was a small, worn booklet, his personal copy of the Constitution. "I want to read you something," he said. "Not from a classified file, not from an FEC record, from the oath of office. The one you took, the one I took. The one every person in this chamber took when they swore to serve the American people." He read it slowly, without theatrical inflection, just the words given the weight they carry when someone actually means them. "I do solemnly swear that I will support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic." He lowered the booklet. "Support and defend," he said, "not for some of it, not for the parts that are convenient or politically useful, all of it. Including the parts that protect speech you disagree with. Including the parts that limit what you can do with government authority. Including the parts that were specifically designed to prevent the kind of political power from accumulating in one place that would allow one person to decide what information the American people are permitted to receive." Kennedy walked through the constitutional text with the fluency of someone who had spent his professional life immersed in it. Article 1, the Bill of Rights. The separation of powers framework. The enumerated limitations on congressional authority. The structural design of a government whose founders understood from personal experience exactly what happens when political power is allowed to operate without accountability to principle. They were not naive, Kennedy said. The people who wrote this document had seen governments corrupt themselves. They had lived under a king. They understood that the same human impulses that make people want power are the impulses that eventually make people abuse it. So they built a system specifically designed to frustrate those impulses. Checks, balances, rights that government cannot override. Limitations on what officials can do even when they believe their intentions justify the action. He paused. And then they required everyone who wanted to serve in that system to take an oath, not to a party, not to a president, not to a donor network, to the Constitution itself, to the document that embodies the principles the whole enterprise is built on. Kennedy looked at the stack of folders on the table. Every document in that record represents a moment when you had a choice between what the Constitution required and what your personal or political interests preferred. And the record shows with remarkable consistency which way you went. 19 times the FBI told you the evidence was not there. 237 times you told the public it was. 23 documented instances of classified information moving from your briefings to media broadcasts. $6.5 million flowing from an industry whose interests you advance with your congressional authority, and an election season information suppression campaign carried out using the tools and authority of your government position. He picked up his Constitution again. This document is not a political weapon. It is not a talking point. It is the foundational agreement between the American people and the government they created to serve them. And when you take an oath to defend it and then spend years finding ways around its most basic protections, you're not just violating a legal obligation, you're breaking faith with every person who trusted you to keep it. There is a particular kind of silence that descends when something true is said plainly in a room full of people who have spent years surrounded by strategic ambiguity. It is not the silence of shock. Exactly. It is more the silence of recognition, the sound of an argument that cannot be refuted because it is built entirely from documented fact and constitutional principle rather than from partisan positioning. That silence filled the chamber as Kennedy prepared his conclusion. He had one more thing to share, not a government document, not a financial record, a collection of letters, handwritten correspondence from constituents in Schiff's district, real people who had written to express what they felt about the representation they had received. Kennedy did not read the letters at length. He cited them briefly, allowing their existence to speak, rather than their content to dominate. A retired teacher from Glendale who had voted for Schiff, believing he would stand against corruption. A small business owner from Burbank who had watched the First Amendment he depended on be treated as an obstacle to manage. A family in Pasadena who had trusted their representative with the expectation that trust would be honored. These are the people this is actually about, Kennedy said. Not the networks, not the donors, not the Intelligence Committee and its classified briefings. The people who got up on election day, went to their polling place, and put their faith in someone to represent their interests and protect their rights. He set the letters down with the care of someone handling something that mattered. Public service is a specific thing, he said, not a concept or a career category, a specific commitment. When you run for office, you are asking people to trust you with authority that belongs to them. They are delegating something precious, the right to participate in their own governance, to someone they are choosing to act on their behalf. That is the transaction. That is the whole arrangement. Kennedy moved to the center of the chamber. When that arrangement works, it is one of the most remarkable things human beings have figured out how to do. A free people governing themselves through chosen representatives, accountable to the Constitution they wrote together, bound by the rights they guaranteed to each other. When it works, there is nothing like it anywhere in history. He stopped, and when it does not work, when someone treats that delegated authority as personal property, as a platform for building a brand or accumulating wealth or serving the interests of financial supporters at the expense of the people who actually did the trusting, then everything the system is built on starts to erode. Kennedy was quiet for a moment. I came from a part of Louisiana where people do not have much patience for fancy explanations of why the rules do not apply to certain people. Where I grew up, the rules apply to everybody or they do not apply to anybody. And the idea that someone could spend years using a position of public trust to enrich themselves, promote documented disinformation, suppress the constitutional rights of the people they were supposed to serve, and then stand before a congressional committee and expect the same institutions they exploited to simply absorb the impact of what they did. That is not how accountability works, not in Louisiana, and it should not be how it works here. He gathered his folders. The American people are not spectators in this system, Kennedy concluded. They are the source of every bit of authority anyone in this building exercises. Every subpoena power, every committee chairmanship, every classified briefing, it all originates with the people. And when the people's representatives forget that, when they start believing the authority belongs to them personally, rather than being temporarily borrowed from the public that granted it, someone has to remind them. He picked up his Constitution one final time. That is what this document is for, he said. And today, that is what this hearing was for. What happened in the minutes after Kennedy finished was not something that gets scripted in political playbooks or anticipated by communications teams. The gallery, which had been silent for the better part of 2 hours, responded in a way that congressional staff described later as unlike anything they had witnessed in years of working the Capitol. Not partisan celebration, not the raucous energy of a debate score, something quieter and more lasting. The recognition that something real had just happened in a place where real things do not always happen. Schiff's attorneys conferred in urgent whispers. Democratic colleagues shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Even journalists who had covered Schiff sympathetically for years were looking at their notebooks and then back at the table of documents with expressions that suggested they were recalculating something. The social media reaction was immediate and bipartisan in a way that political observers found difficult to process. The clips that spread most rapidly were not Kennedy's most aggressive moments. They were the quiet ones. The moments where he simply laid two documents next to each other and let the gap between them speak. The moments where he cited the constitutional text and then cited the conduct without editorializing about the distance between them. Those clips spread because they were compelling, not as politics, but as accountability. And accountability, it turns out, still has an audience in America that crosses party lines. Within 24 hours, the hearing had generated news coverage across every major network and publication. The coverage varied significantly in tone and framing, as coverage of politically charged events always does. But even the most sympathetic accounts of Schiff's position were forced to engage with the specific documentary record Kennedy had presented, because that record did not leave much room for alternative interpretation. The FEC documents were public. The financial disclosures were public. The correlation between donation patterns and voting records was a matter of documented fact. The FBI briefing records, the ones showing what the intelligence community had told the committee while Schiff was publicly claiming to possess evidence the committee had been told did not exist. Those were now part of the congressional record. Federal investigators who review congressional hearings as a matter of standard procedure were reported to have immediately flagged multiple elements of Kennedy's presentation as warranting further review. When a sitting senator presents documented evidence of potential perjury before Congress, potential unauthorized disclosure of classified information, and potential coordination between a government official and private companies to circumvent constitutional protections. That is not the kind of thing that gets filed and forgotten. The political implications extended well beyond Schiff's individual situation. The hearing had forced a conversation about a set of behaviors that had become normalized in Washington over the preceding decade. The casual relationship between congressional positions and media personas, the financial architecture connecting donor networks to legislative outcomes, the ways in which the tools of government authority could be pointed at constitutional rights through intermediaries who were technically private entities. Kennedy had not simply held one politician accountable. He had documented a pattern of behavior and placed it against the constitutional framework that the pattern violated. He had done it with the precision of a lawyer who understood both the law and the facts. And he had done it in a public forum, on the record, in front of cameras broadcasting to millions of people. The easy political lesson from what happened in that hearing room is a partisan one. One side wins, one side loses, but that reading misses the more important story. The more important story is about accountability and what it requires. Accountability is not primarily a political concept. It is a constitutional one. The entire architecture of American government rests on the idea that power does not belong to the people who exercise it. It is borrowed temporarily from the citizens who grant it, and it must be exercised within the limits they have established and in service of the interests they have entrusted to their representatives. When that framework holds, democratic government functions. When it erodes, what grows in its place is not just corruption in the narrow financial sense. It is a different relationship between citizens and government. One where the governed become spectators and the people elected to serve them become the people served by the system. Kennedy's hearing mattered not because it was politically satisfying, though for many Americans it clearly was. It mattered because it demonstrated that the constitutional framework still has teeth. That documented evidence still matters, that the oath of office still means something when someone who understands its implications decides to take it seriously. The founding generation was not optimistic about human nature. They built a government designed to function despite the reality that people in positions of power will frequently pursue their own interests at the expense of their public obligations. That is not cynicism, that is constitutional realism, and the answer they arrived at was not to assume that office holders would always act honorably. It was to build a system where the consequences of not acting honorably were real and visible. That system worked on that day in that hearing room because a senator from Louisiana had spent months assembling the documented record that the system requires and had the constitutional knowledge and the personal integrity to present it publicly and without flinching. The Constitution, Kennedy had said, works. You just have to be willing to use it. He was right, and that might be the most important thing that happened in that chamber. Not the political score, not the viral clips, not the fundraising implications, or the polling movements. The demonstration in real time that the constitutional framework the founders built is still capable of delivering the accountability it was designed to provide. When someone actually reads the documents, when someone actually knows the law, when someone actually remembers why they took the oath they took on that afternoon. In that hearing room, all three of those things were true of one senator from Louisiana, and the result was something that the chamber had not seen in a long time. The truth, plainly spoken, backed by documentation grounded in constitutional principle. And for a few hours, the whole country was watching.